The screen is flooded with the blinding gold of a Seattle morning, refracting off the polished glass of a dozen surveillance monitors. We see a close-up of a hand resting on a mahogany desk, heavy, platinum rings on the fingers, and the dark, intricate ink of a soaring hawk winding around a thick wrist, disappearing under a crisp, white silk sleeve. "I didn't bring her here to be a mother. I brought her here because she was a ghost," Calith's voice rumbles, heavy with a gravelly, tired edge. "But the cameras, they don't see what I see. They see a woman who knows too much about the pain, and not enough about the danger." On the center screen, Solene sits in a plush rocking chair in a sun-drenched guest suite. She is an Afro-Korean woman of quiet, regal poise, her face a mask of weary devotion. She cradles her infant daughter, Alara, whose tiny arm is encased in a stark white cast. Solene isn't crying. She is humming a low, resonant melody, her eyes fixed on the door with the intensity of a cornered lioness. Calith leans into the blue glow of the monitors, the tattoos on his neck tensing as he narrows his eyes. "Who did this to your child, Solene?" The estate sat atop the Seattle cliffs like a crown of glass and cold steel. Inside, the air was filtered, sterilized, and heavy with the scent of white lilies and the silence of a man who owned everything but felt nothing. Calith stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, the midday sun catching the sharp, predatory lines of his jaw and the tattoos that marked him as a man of the shadows. To the world, he was a ruthless titan. To the terrified woman in his guest wing, he was a stranger who held the keys to her life. Solene had arrived 3 days ago, a shadow in the bright light of his foyer. She was a woman of few words, her heritage written in the graceful slant of her eyes and the deep, rich tone of her skin. She had come because of an accident, a digital scream sent to a wrong number. "He broke my little baby's arm." Calith had tracked that text, expecting a scam, but he found a woman standing in a crumbling apartment, holding a whimpering child and a heavy iron skillet, ready to fight the world. Now, every inch of her world was mapped in 4K resolution. Calith watched the way she tested the temperature of the milk, the way she flinched when the wind hit the glass, and the way she held her daughter as if she were made of spun sugar. He was looking for the man who had caused that break, a man Solene refused to name. But as he watched her in the unwavering light of the afternoon, he realized that the mystery wasn't just in her past. It was in the way her presence was slowly thawing the ice in his own fortress. "Hello, my friend. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Share your location in the comments so I can see which part of the world you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on upcoming videos. Now, let's dive straight into the story." The light in the Seattle apartment was thin, gray, and filtered through years of accumulated grime on the window panes. It was a sharp, biting contrast to the high-end technology Calith carried in his tailored pocket. He had been sitting in the rear of his armored SUV, the interior smelling of expensive leather and the cold metallic tang of a pressurized cabin. He was preparing for a board meeting that would effectively dismantle a rival shipping empire, his mind a grid of numbers and strategic vulnerabilities. Then the encrypted phone on his dashboard, a device that didn't technically exist, chirped. It was a sound that made his driver's shoulders tense. That line was a ghost frequency, reserved for 3 people in the world. Calith picked it up, his fingers, marked with the dark ink of a soaring hawk, moving with a predator's grace. The message was a jagged, digital scream. "He broke my little baby's arm, please, God help me." Calith didn't believe in God, and he certainly didn't believe in accidents. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen. The text hadn't come from his associates. It was a wrong number, a cosmic glitch. But the raw, unadulterated terror in the words poked at a memory he had spent a decade burying. He didn't delete it. Instead, he tapped a button on the console. "Trace it," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Find the origin point and pull the building's schematics." Within 6 minutes, a red dot pulsed on his digital map, a crumbling residential block in a neighborhood the city had forgotten. Calith didn't redirect his driver to the boardroom. He redirected him to the edge of the world. When the SUV pulled up to the tenement, the midday sun was at its peak, turning the asphalt into a shimmering heat trap. Calith stepped out, the sharp lines of his jaw and the hawk on his neck catching the light. His men moved in silence, a wall of black suits and stone-cold eyes. They didn't knock. The door to apartment 4B was taken off its hinges with the quiet, hydraulic hiss of a master key. Inside, the room was suffocating. It smelled of stale formula and the metallic scent of old radiators. Solene was standing in the center of the kitchen, her Afro-Korean features a mask of pure, survivalist instinct. She didn't scream when the door vanished. She didn't drop to her knees. Instead, she reached for a heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove and stepped in front of the bassinet. "Get out," she whispered, her voice a serrated edge. Caliph stepped into the room, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. He looked past her to the bassinet, where a tiny, whimpering infant lay, her arm twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle. The sight hit him like a physical blow. He looked at Solene. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown, her knuckles white as she gripped the pan. "I'm not the one you're hiding from," Caliph said, his tone shifting into something surprisingly soft, yet authoritative. "I'm the one who's going to make sure he never finds you again." Solene's chest heaved as she processed the man before her. He didn't look like a social worker. He looked like a king of the underworld. She saw the expensive rings, the tattoos that spoke of a violent history, and the way his men occupied the room like shadows. But then she looked at his eyes. They weren't looking at her as a victim. They were looking at her as an ally. "Who are you?" she asked, the pan lowering just an inch. "A wrong number," Caliph replied. He gestured to the open door, where the sunlight hit the polished black paint of his vehicle like a beacon. "But I am the only number that matters now. Pack what you can carry in 60 seconds. We're leaving." Solene looked at the infant, then at the crumbling walls that had failed to protect her. She grabbed a small bag of diapers and a tattered Korean storybook. She didn't ask where they were going. She simply tucked her daughter into her chest, shielding the broken arm with her own body, and walked into the blinding light of a new, dangerous life. The drive to the cliffside estate was a study in silence and high-speed motion. Solene sat in the back of the SUV, her eyes fixed on the tinted window as the city of Seattle transformed from gray concrete to lush, emerald forests. Every time the car hit a bump, she winced, her arms tightening around her daughter, Alara, as if her own skin could serve as a splint. Caliph sat in the front, watching her through the rearview mirror. He noticed the way she scanned the road behind them, her eyes darting to the side mirrors every 30 seconds. She was a woman who had been hunted before. He felt a strange, internal resonance, a recognition of the hypervigilance that had defined his own life. When the gates of the estate finally swung open, the sheer beauty of the place was jarring. The house was a masterpiece of brutalist architecture and transparent grace, a crown of glass and cold steel perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the Pacific. The midday sun turned the entire structure into a glowing diamond. "Welcome to the fortress," Caliph said as the car slowed to a halt. They stepped out into air that was salt-tangled and clean, a world away from the smog of the apartment. Solene stood on the white gravel, looking up at the towering glass walls. It felt like a trap, but a beautiful one. "The West Wing has been prepared for you," Caliph explained, leading her through the foyer. The floors were white marble, polished so brightly they reflected the blue of the sky. Security guards stood at every junction, but they were discreet, nodding silently as Caliph passed. He led her to a suite that was bathed in the unwavering light of the afternoon. Waiting in the room was a man in a crisp, white lab coat, Dr. Aris. He was a man whose hands had repaired the children of presidents and billionaires. He didn't ask Solene for her insurance or her history. He simply stepped forward and held out his hands. "May I see her?" he asked gently. Solene hesitated, her eyes flickering to Caliph. Caliph gave a single, slow nod. "He is the best in the world, Solene. Let him work." For the next hour, the room was a theater of quiet, clinical excellence. Solene stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her fingers tracing a faint scar on her own wrist as she watched the doctor work on Alara. The baby's cries were muffled by the thick, soundproof glass of the room. They used a lightweight, high-tech polymer cast, pristine white, looking more like a piece of art than a bandage. Caliph stayed in the room, leaning against a mahogany bookshelf, his eyes never leaving Solene. He was fascinated by her restraint. Most mothers would be hysterical. She was a statue of grief and resolve. "She's stabilized," Dr. Aris finally said, packing his instruments. "The break was clean but deliberate. It took a significant amount of force. She needs rest and a sterile environment." When the doctor left, a heavy silence descended on the suite. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers across the marble floor. Solene walked over to the crib and touched the new cast. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to face Caliph, the light silhouetting her vibrant hair and the sharp, beautiful lines of her face. "A man like you don't do anything for free. What do you want from us?" Caliph walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. The hawk on his neck seemed to shimmer in the dying light. "I want the man who did this," he said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, cold intent. "Not for justice, not for the law, but because he sent a message to my phone and I don't like being interrupted." He turned to leave, his boots clicking softly on the marble. "There is food in the kitchen. My staff will provide whatever you need. But do not try to leave the estate, Solene. Until I know who he is, the world outside these walls is a graveyard for people like you." As the door shut, Solene looked up at the corner of the ceiling. She saw the small, unblinking eye of a 4K camera. She realized then that she hadn't just found a savior. She had found a watchman who was going to study every secret she had. She sat in the rocking chair, clutching her daughter, as the golden afternoon turned into a watchful emerald twilight. The sun was a high, unapologetic disk of white gold hanging over the Puget Sound, turning the glass walls of the estate into a series of blinding mirrors. Inside the surveillance suite, the temperature was kept at a precise, chilly 68 degrees to protect the humming servers that processed terabytes of high-definition secrets. Caliph sat in his ergonomic chair, the dark silk of his shirt straining against his shoulders as he leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the monitor wall. On screen 4, Solene was moving through the guest suite. She didn't know he was watching, or perhaps she did, and she simply didn't care. She was a woman of rhythmic, deliberate motions. She walked to the window, her hand hovering just inches from the reinforced glass, her eyes scanning the horizon not for beauty, but for silhouettes. Caliph watched the way she navigated the room. She never stood with her back to the door. She never sat in a chair that didn't offer a clear line of sight to the hallway. Even here, in the safest structure in the Pacific Northwest, she was a soldier in a war no one else could see. "She's hypervigilant," a voice crackled through the intercom. It was Kalen, his head of security, speaking from the gatehouse. "She hasn't touched the high-end meal the chef prepared. She's eating the crackers and fruit we left for the baby. She's afraid of being drugged or indebted, boss. And there's something else. We've got a black sedan idling 3 miles down the cliff road. It doesn't have plates, and it's been there since 10 a.m. Calith's jaw tightened, the tiger tattoo on his neck shifting with the muscle. "Don't engage yet. Just ghost them. I want to see who comes out of that car when the sun starts to dip." He turned his attention back to the center screen. Solene had picked up Alara. The infant was awake now, her tiny face scrunched in a silent yawn. Solene's expression changed the moment she looked at her child. The hardness in her eyes dissolved into a pool of soft, aching tenderness. She pressed her forehead against the baby's, whispering something in a low, melodic tone. Caliph adjusted the audio gain, filtering out the hum of the HVAC system. "Stars will watch you, little moon," Solene whispered in a blend of Korean and English, her voice a fragile thread of hope. "The mountain will hide you. The water will wash away the scent of the wolf. We are small, but we are made of stone." Caliph felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of his neck. He had grown up in a world of transactional loyalty and violent legacies. He had seen men kill for power and women die for greed. But he had never seen a woman terraform her own fear into a lullaby. He watched her sit in the rocking chair, her movements fluid and protective, shielding Alara's cast white arm from even the softest breeze of the air conditioner. He realized then that the text message hadn't been an accident of fate, but a collision of 2 similar souls. He was a man who watched everything because he trusted nothing. She was a woman who watched everything because she was the only shield her daughter had. He tapped a command on his keyboard, zooming in on Solene's face. The 4K resolution was so sharp he could see the faint, silvery scar running along her jawline, a mark of a struggle, a sign of a close call. "Who did this to you, Solene?" he asked the empty room. His fingers traced the soaring hawk on his own hand. "And why does he think I'll let him finish what he started?" The afternoon sun had reached its zenith, casting long, sharp shadows across the estate's private botanical garden. It was a space designed for quiet reflection, filled with rare, white flora that thrived in the cool Seattle mist. Calith stood by a stone fountain, the water cascading in a rhythmic, metallic pulse. He had left the surveillance room because the silence was starting to echo. A soft crunch of gravel made him turn. Solene was walking toward him, Alara strapped to her chest in a breathable wrap. She looked different in the daylight, less like a ghost and more like a queen in exile. The bright light hit the rich, obsidian tones of her hair and the deep amber of her skin. She stopped 10 feet away, a distance that felt like a border. "The baby is sleeping," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The doctor, he did a good job. Thank you." Calith didn't move. "He's the best. I don't pay for mediocrity." Solene looked around the garden, her eyes lingering on the high walls and the subtle gleam of the security cameras tucked into the stonework. "It's a beautiful cage, Calith, but the air here, it's too clean. It makes me feel like I'm in a laboratory." "Safety is rarely comfortable," Calith replied, stepping closer. As he moved, the sunlight caught the tattoos on his hands, the intricate, dark lines that told a story of a life lived in the trenches of the underground. Solene didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at his hands with a clinical curiosity. "You have a hawk on your neck," she noted, her gaze traveling upward. "In my father's village in Korea, they say the hawk is the only bird that looks directly into the sun. It sees everything, but it is always alone." "Your father was a wise man," Calith said, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "He was a watchmaker," she corrected. "He taught me that if you listen to the gears of a machine long enough, they'll tell you where the rust is hiding. People are no different." She reached out to adjust the wrap around Alara, and for a fleeting second the sleeve of her linen shirt pulled back. Calith saw it then, not just the scar on her jaw, but a series of thin, white lines on her wrists. They weren't from a machine. They were defensive wounds, marks of someone who had raised their arms to ward off a blow. Calith reached out, his hand hovering near her wrist. He didn't touch her, he knew better than to startle a survivor, but he pointed to the marks. Those weren't from a wrong number incident. That's a history. Who is he, Solene? The man who thinks he can break what I've decided to protect. Solene pulled her sleeve down, her face hardening. The warmth of the sun seemed to vanish from her expression. He is a man who believes the world is a series of rooms he is allowed to enter. He believes that because he has a title and a clean record, his hands are never dirty. But I saw what he did in the dark, Calith. And when I tried to leave, he decided that if he couldn't own us, he would break us. "A man with a title," Calith mused, his mind already spinning through the list of public officials and corporate giants he held in his pocket. "A man who thinks he's untouchable. Those are my favorite kind of targets. They have so much further to fall." He looked at Solene, and for the first time the emotional restraint between them flickered. It wasn't romance, it was a recognition of shared wreckage. Two people who had been forged in fires they didn't start. "Stay in the light, Solene," Calith said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "As long as you are in this garden, the wolf can only howl at the gate. He cannot enter." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her in the shimmering heat of the afternoon. He had work to do. He had a name to find, and a clean man to ruin. Behind him, the sound of the fountain continued, a steady, relentless drip that sounded exactly like a countdown. The high noon sun baked the white stone of the estate's exterior, but inside the guest wing, the atmosphere was cooled by a silent, invisible stream of climate-controlled air. Solene sat on the floor of the nursery, the bright light catching the intricate braids of her hair as she watched Alara sleep. The baby's new cast, a clean, surgical white, rested against the soft yellow of her blanket. It was a peaceful image, yet Solene felt the phantom weight of the cameras pressing against her skin. She stood up, her joints popping in the silence, and walked toward the center of the room. Hanging from the ceiling was something that hadn't been there when she arrived, a hand-carved wooden mobile. It was a masterpiece of balance and restraint. The pieces were shaped like soaring hawks, their wings outstretched in a perpetual glide. They didn't spin with the chaotic energy of a toy. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, caught in the imperceptible currents of the room's ventilation. Solene reached out a scarred hand, her fingertips hovering just inches from the wood. She realized then that this was a message from Caliph. It wasn't a gift of comfort, but a statement of presence. The hawk was his mark, his signature on the world. By placing it here, he was telling her that even when he wasn't standing in the room, his eyes were on her. He was the invisible thread connecting her safety to his power. She walked to the window, looking out over the cliffs. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean was a sheet of hammered silver under the sun. On the winding private road that led to the estate, she saw a flicker of black. A car. It was too far away to identify, but she knew the silhouette of a predator when she saw one. The wolf was still howling at the gate. Back in the surveillance hub, Caliph watched Solene through the screen. He saw her study the mobile. He saw the way she looked at the window. He admired her silence. It was a weapon she used to keep her secrets from leaking out into his sterilized halls. He tapped a finger against his hawk tattoo, his mind racing through the forensic data his team had pulled from the wrong number text. "Boss," Kalen's voice came through the encrypted link. "We intercepted a digital ping coming from a localized tower. Someone is trying to bypass our signal jammers. They aren't looking for you. They're looking for a device registered to a Solene Kim." Caliph's eyes narrowed into predatory slits. "Let them ping, but feed them a ghost location 3 miles out in the Sound. Let them chase the water while we find the source. And Kalen, make sure the nursery blinds are set to auto-reflect. If they're using long-range optics, I want them to see nothing but their own reflection." Caliph leaned back, his rings catching the blue light of the monitors. He felt a strange, surging protective instinct, a feeling that was usually reserved for his assets and his territory. But this felt different. It felt personal. He wasn't just protecting a woman and a child anymore. He was protecting the only thing in his world that hadn't been bought with a signature or a threat. He watched Solene sit back down by the crib, her hand resting on the wooden hawk, and he realized that the invisible thread went both ways. She was tethered to his protection, but he was becoming tethered to her survival. The golden hour of the afternoon usually brought a sense of calm to the estate, but for Caliph, the lengthening shadows only made the truth clearer. He sat in his library, surrounded by leather-bound books that smelled of history and sandalwood, his laptop open to a restricted government database. The he Solene had spoken of, the man who thought he was a king in a room of commoners, finally had a name. Councilman Julian Vane. Vane was a man of clean reputation, a frequent guest at Caliph's own charity galas. He was a man who championed family values while hiding a rot so deep it had poisoned his own bloodline. Caliph stared at the man's official portrait, a smiling politician with silver hair and eyes that looked like cold glass. The data showed that Vane had been the one who funded the apartment complex where Solene had lived. He hadn't just been her pursuer. He had been her landlord, her benefactor, and eventually, her executioner. A soft knock at the library door interrupted his thoughts. Solene stepped in, the bright sunlight from the hallway silhouetting her regal frame. She looked at the screen, and for a heartbeat, her composure shattered. Her breath hitched, a jagged sound in the quiet room. "You found him," she whispered. Caliph turned the screen away, but it was too late. "I found a ghost with a title, Solene. Councilman Vane is part of a shadow cabinet that controls the city's development. He is powerful, well-connected, and he has a security detail that rivals mine." Solene walked into the room, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. She stopped at the edge of his desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He didn't hurt Alara because he was angry, Caliph. He did it because I found the ledger. He's been using the development funds to launder money for the docks. He thought if he broke her, I would be too busy grieving to speak. He thought a mother's pain was a distraction. He didn't realize it's a fuel." Caliph stood up, his presence looming in the dim light of the library. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. The hawk on his neck seemed to pulse with a dark energy. He made a mistake. He didn't just hurt a child. He sent a message to the one man in this city who doesn't answer to the shadow cabinet. "What are you going to do?" Solene asked, her eyes searching his for a sign of hesitation. "I'm going to do what I do best," Calith replied, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous low. "I'm going to dismantle his life gear by gear. I'm going to take away his title, his money, and his freedom. But first, I'm going to make sure he knows exactly whose wrong number he accidentally called." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, offering a rare moment of silent solidarity. Solene didn't pull away. In the bright, dying light of the afternoon, they stood together, the watchman and the survivor, forming an alliance that was built on the ruins of their enemies. The mystery of the text was gone. In its place was a declaration of war. "Rest tonight, Solene," Calith said softly. "The wolf has a name now, and tomorrow we hunt." The sun hung like a heavy, golden coin over the Pacific, casting long, sharp rays through the reinforced glass of the estate's grand atrium. This was the heart of the house, a sprawling indoor garden where exotic white flora climbed toward the skylights, their petals translucent in the uncompromising midday heat. Solene stood in the center of the path, her shadow stretching long and thin across the marble floor. She held Alara close to her chest, the baby's weight a familiar comfort, but her eyes were fixed on the far end of the hall. There, resting on a pedestal that was usually reserved for $1 million sculpture, sat a bouquet of white lilies. They were beautiful, yet in this house. They were an invasive species. Calith's air was scrubbed, filtered, and void of such organic perfumes. The scent was thick, cloying, and carried the heavy note of a funeral parlor. A small, cream-colored card was tucked between the stalks. Solene didn't need to read it to know what it said, but she couldn't look away. The security of the estate was supposed to be absolute. No one entered without a biometric scan. No package arrived without a thermal sweep. Yet, here they were, blooming in the center of her sanctuary like a cancer. The heavy, rhythmic click of boots echoed against the marble. Calith entered the atrium, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The hawk on his neck seemed to darken as the blood rushed to his skin. He didn't look at Solene first, he looked at the flowers. He walked to the pedestal, his movements as precise as a surgeon, and picked up the card. He read it aloud, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the air feel colder. "I found you, Solene. You can't hide a miracle in a glass box forever." Calith's hand tightened around the card until the expensive cardstock crumpled into a shapeless ball. He turned to Solene, his eyes reflecting the harsh, overhead sun. "Kalen has already been demoted for this breach," he said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal intent. "They didn't break in. They used a delivery drone with a high-frequency stealth coding, a piece of tech that belongs to the city's municipal surveillance fleet. Vane is flaunting his reach. He's telling us that even in the light, he can touch you." Solene felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She looked at the lilies, then at the man who had promised to protect her. "He's not just looking for me, Calith. He's looking for the ledger. He knows I have it, and he knows that as long as I'm alive, his clean reputation is a countdown to a life sentence." Calith walked over to the bouquet and with one swift, violent motion, swept the vase off the pedestal. It shattered against the marble, glass and water spraying like shrapnel. He stepped on the lilies, his heavy boots crushing the white petals into the stone. "This estate is now a dead zone," Calith declared, turning to face the 4K cameras that lined the ceiling. "No signals in, no signals out. We are off the grid. If he wants to reach into my house again, he'll have to do it in person. And if he does that, he won't be leaving." He reached out and placed a hand on Solene's shoulder. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the room. "The lilies are dead, Solene. From now on, the only thing that grows here is our response. Go back to the nursery. I need to make a phone call to a man who specializes in making untouchable politicians disappear from the public eye." As Solene walked away, she looked back one last time. Calith was standing in the middle of the wreckage of the flowers, silhouetted by the brilliant sun, looking like a god of war presiding over a ruined garden. The mystery was no longer about a wrong number. It was a battle for the very ground they stood on. The library was bathed in a deep, amber glow as the afternoon began its slow transition toward evening. Dust motes danced in the light that poured through the high windows, settling on the thousands of leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. Caliph sat behind his desk, his hands clasped, the hawk tattoo on his wrist visible as he watched Solene. She had requested this meeting. She had spent the last hour packing the perimeter of the guest wing, finally realizing that silence was no longer a shield, it was a liability. She sat across from him, her back straight, her Afro-Korean features illuminated by the setting sun. "You asked me who he was," she began, her voice steady but thin. "You asked why a councilman would risk his career to break a baby's arm. You thought it was just about the money laundering at the docks. But it's deeper than that, Caliph." Caliph leaned forward, his rings clicking against the mahogany desk. "I'm listening, Solene. Give me the truth, gear by gear." Solene took a deep breath, her eyes fixing on a point somewhere behind Caliph's head. "Julian Vane isn't just the man I worked for. He isn't just the landlord who owned my building. He is the man who signed Alara's birth certificate. He is her father." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the server seemed to fade. Caliph didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed until they were sharp as flint. "I was a junior analyst in his office," Solene continued, the words spilling out like a confession. "I was young and he was everything the city said he was, charming, powerful, attentive. But then I saw the ledger. I saw the names of the people he was paying off, people in your circle, Caliph, people who handle your logistics. When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't see a child. He saw a liability that could be used to tie him to the analyst who knew too much." She looked down at her scarred wrists, the white lines standing out against her skin. He didn't break her arm in a fit of rage. He did it systematically. He held her down and told me that if I ever went to the press with the ledger, the next time, it wouldn't be an arm. It would be her life. He wanted me to be a broken mother because a broken mother is easy to control. Caliph felt a cold, predatory heat rise in his chest. He had done many things in his life. He had operated in the gray areas of morality for decades. But this was a brand of evil that even he found repulsive. To use a child as a torture device for a mother's silence was a line he would never cross. "He thinks his blood gives him ownership," Caliph said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He thinks that because he provided the DNA, he has the right to destroy the vessel. He is mistaken." "He has the police in his pocket, Caliph," Solene warned, her eyes filled with a desperate light. "He has the judges. He can claim I'm unstable. He can claim I kidnapped her. That's why the text was a mistake. I was trying to reach a lawyer who had promised to hide us, but my hands were shaking so hard." "Your hands aren't shaking now," Caliph interrupted, standing up and walking around the desk. He stopped in front of her, his presence a towering wall of ink and silk. "And you didn't reach a lawyer. You reached me. And I don't care about his bloodline or his title. In this house, the only law that exists is the one I write. And I've just decided that Julian Vane's time in the light is over." He reached down and took her hand, the one with the scars, and squeezed it gently. "We're not hiding anymore, Solene. We're going to use that ledger to burn his world down. And when the smoke clears, Alara will have a name that isn't his. She'll have a future that he can't touch." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the library into a dramatic, violet twilight. The mystery of the father was solved, but the war had only just begun. Caliph turned to his monitors, his fingers flying across the keys as he began to coordinate a strike that would change the city forever. The morning sun didn't just rise over the Seattle cliffs, it detonated, turning the Pacific Ocean into a blinding sheet of white fire and flooding Caliph's estate with an uncompromising, clinical brilliance. This was the day he had promised Solene. There would be no shadows left for Julian Vane to hide in. In the central hub of the surveillance room, the air was cold, smelling of ozone and the metallic tang of high-end processing units. Caliph sat at the console, his hawk-inked fingers dancing across a custom-built glass keyboard. "He's on the move," Kalen's voice crackled through the comms. "The councilman is heading to the Botanical Conservatory for the Children's Future Gala. He's wearing his best smile and a bulletproof vest under his tuxedo. He thinks he's walking into a coronation. Calith's eyes narrowed, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his pupils like a digital predator. He's walking into a funeral for his reputation. Is the ledger decrypted and synced to the local news satellites? Ready on your mark, boss. Every screen in the city, from the billboards in Times Square to the tablets in the hands of the gala guests, is slave to our server. He won't even see it coming. Solene entered the room, carrying Alara. The baby was wearing a soft sundress, the white cast on her arm decorated with small, hand-painted flowers Solene had added that morning. Solene looked at Calith, her Afro-Korean features set in a mask of grim, expectant peace. She wasn't the terrified woman from the apartment anymore. She was the architect of a reckoning. "It's time," she said softly. "He needs to see what he broke. He needs to see that we are still standing in the light." Calith stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the glowing screens. He reached out and touched the small, painted cast on Alara's arm. "Today, we don't use guns, Solene. In my world, a ruined name is a slower, more painful death than a bullet. He'll be a ghost before the sun hits the horizon." They arrived at the conservatory just as the midday sun hit its peak. The building was a cathedral of glass, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the chatter of the city's elite. Julian Vane was on the stage, basking in the applause, his silver hair shimmering under the spotlights. He was mid-sentence, talking about protecting our most vulnerable citizens, when the world stopped. Calith walked into the back of the hall, his presence a dark anchor in the room of bright silk and champagne. He held his phone up and tapped a single icon. Simultaneously, every screen in the conservatory flickered from Vane's face to a high-definition image of the ledger, the money laundering logs, the kickbacks, and finally, the video file from the estate's 4K cameras. It wasn't just data. It was the recording of Solene's confession, her voice echoing through the speakers, steady and heartbreaking. The room went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Vane froze, his face turning a sickly, ashen gray as he looked out at a crowd that was no longer applauding but recoiling. He looked toward the back of the room and met Calith's eyes. Calith didn't smile. He simply raised his hand, the one with the hawk, and pointed to the exit. The untouchable man was suddenly a pariah. As the police, real officers, not the ones on Vane's payroll, moved in to escort him out through the side doors, Solene stepped into the center aisle. She didn't say a word. She simply held Alara up into the bright, uncompromising sunlight. Vane looked at his daughter, then at the woman he had tried to break, and he realized the truth. He hadn't just lost his career. He had lost the one piece of his legacy that was actually worth saving. Calith stepped beside Solene, his arm shielding her from the sudden swarm of cameras. "The sun is finally out, Solene," he whispered into the chaos, "and he can never make it dark again." A week had passed since the brightest day. The estate was still a fortress of glass and steel, but the air inside felt different. It was no longer sterilized and heavy with failure, but light and filled with the scent of the ocean. The Pacific breeze blew through the open balcony doors of the guest wing, carrying the sound of seagulls and the distant rhythm of the tides. Calith stood on the cliffside deck, the midday sun warming the ink on his neck. He was watching Solene and Alara down on the small, private beach below. Alara's cast had been removed that morning in a quiet ceremony of healing. The baby was sitting in the sand, her little arms reaching out to grab at the foam of a retreating wave. She was whole again. Solene looked up and caught Calith's gaze. She smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes and waved. She wasn't a maid, and she wasn't a guest. She was the woman who had brought a soul back to his cold, glass box. Calith walked down the stone stairs to the beach, his boots crunching on the shells and sand. He stopped beside them, looking out at the horizon where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. The mystery of the text message, the wrong number that changed everything, was a memory now, a catalyst for a future neither of them had seen coming. "The foundation has been set up," Calith said, his voice softer than it had ever been. "The Solene Alara initiative. It will fund legal aid and high-security housing for mothers who are hiding in the shadows. You'll be the director. No one will ever have to send a text to a stranger again." Solene stood up, brushing the sand from her dress. She looked at the man who had been her watchman, then her savior, and now her partner. "You spent your whole life building walls to keep people out, Caliph. Now you're building bridges to bring them in." "I found I didn't like the view from the top of the cliff when I was the only one standing there," Caliph replied, his rings glinting in the sun. He reached down and picked up Alara. The baby didn't flinch at the tattoos or the hawk on his neck. She simply reached out a tiny, healed hand and touched the tiger on his throat. Caliph froze for a heartbeat, his eyes closing as he felt the small, warm palm against his skin. It was the ultimate achievement, a moment of pure, unmanufactured trust. "We should go back inside," Solene said, her voice filled with a quiet, triumphant peace. "The sun is at its peak and Alara needs her nap. And you have a legacy to rewrite." They walked back up the cliff toward the crown of glass and steel. It was no longer a cage or a laboratory. It was a home. The mystery was gone, replaced by a clarity as sharp as the Seattle light. The watchman had finally turned his cameras off, realizing that the most beautiful things in the world are the ones you don't need to monitor. As they entered the atrium, the light hit the floor, reflecting a spectrum of colors that danced across the marble. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were living, breathing proof that even the most broken things can be mended if you have the courage to reach out to a wrong number, and the strength to stay in the light until the truth comes home. As the sun dips below the Pacific horizon, leaving only a trail of gold on the water, we are left with more than just a story of a wrong number. We are left with a reminder of the invisible threads that bind us together in a world that often feels cold and disconnected. The journey of Caliph and Solene teaches us a profound truth. Our scars are not just reminders of where we've been broken. They are the blueprints of our strength. For many of you watching, you might feel like Solene, trapped in a room where the walls are closing in, holding onto something precious while the world tries to take it away. You might feel like your voice is just a whisper in a storm. But remember, it was a single, desperate text sent into the void that changed the course of an entire empire. Never underestimate the power of reaching out. Sometimes, the wrong person is exactly who you were meant to find. And for those who feel like Caliph, shielded by walls of your own making, watching the world through a screen but never truly touching it, this story is for you too. It reminds us that true power isn't found in what you can monitor, but in what you choose to protect. Success, wealth, and status are hollow echoes unless they are used to lift the weight off those who cannot carry it alone. The greatest achievement isn't building a fortress of glass. It's having the courage to open the gates. So, as you go about your day, look at the people around you with a little more clarity. Behind every silence is a story. Behind every scar is a survivor. Stand in your light. Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. Because in the end, we aren't defined by the people who tried to break us. We are defined by the beauty of how we choose to put the pieces back together. Stay in the light. Stay watchful, and remember, you are never as alone as the darkness makes you feel.